Some men crumble when their wives betray them. I don't. I get even. My name is Jack Chandler. I'm 58 years old. Former Marine, now a security consultant. Grew up on a farm outside of Amarillo, Texas. Hard work and discipline weren't choices, they were the way life worked. My father didn't have patience for excuses and neither did the Corps. I buried my wife 10 years ago when a drunk driver ran a red light and took everything I loved. I learned then that the world doesn't hand out fairness. You take control or you get crushed. The coffee in my truck's cup holder had gone cold. I'd been sitting outside Taylor's office building for 15 minutes watching. The glass lobby doors slid open and there she was. Perfect blonde hair, navy dress that looked tailored, clicking across the sidewalk in heels she never used to wear. She pulled her phone out of her purse, typed something, smiled at the screen. Then she turned right instead of left. Taylor didn't take the train home on Wednesdays. I set my coffee down, turned the key in the ignition and pulled into traffic, keeping 2 cars between us. She walked fast, like she had a place to be, slipping through the evening crowd toward the high-end bars on McKinney Street. She stopped outside the Sterling Room, the kind of place where drinks cost as much as a steak and the waiters act like they're doing you a favor. Then he showed up. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the world bends for you. Nathaniel Larson, CEO of Larson Capital. Rich, powerful, and according to the folder in my glove box, married twice and known for keeping a rotation of younger women on the side. Taylor put a hand on his arm, laughed at something he said. He leaned in close, whispered something, and she didn't pull away. I stared at them through the windshield. No anger. No shock. Just the confirmation of what I already knew. The Sterling Room had tinted windows, but I knew how to get what I needed. I pulled into a spot across the street, walked a block down to McKenna's Cafe. Place had been there for years, one of those spots where old men nursed coffee and talked politics. I pushed the door open and there was Peter Newton, the owner. Bearded, always in an apron, always with something to say. Jack. Hell, haven't seen you in a while. Usual. Just coffee, I said, taking a seat at the counter. How's business? Oh, you know. Folks still like their caffeine and gossip. We had a bit of excitement last week, some big shots eating over at the Sterling Room. Guy owns that investment firm, Larson something. Comes in here for an espresso now and then. Thinks it makes him relatable. I stirred my coffee. That right? Yeah. Been bringing a woman in a few times. Blonde, real put together. His wife, I figured, but Uma, he gestured toward his waitress. She says he's married to some brunette. So, either he's got a fast-moving hairstylist or he's got a side piece. I took a sip of coffee. People like that always think they won't get caught. Peter chuckled. Money makes 'em stupid. They think it buys silence. Does it? Not always. Not when you piss off the wrong people. He set the coffee pot down, watching me like he knew I was asking for a reason. Something on your mind, Jack? I shook my head. Just making conversation. But I wasn't. I already knew how this ended for them. I sat in McKenna's for another 20 minutes, letting Peter talk about the latest town drama while my coffee cooled. He didn't pry, but he knew. Men like him, men who listen for a living, can smell when something's off. When I got back to my truck, I checked my watch. Taylor wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, maybe 3. I didn't follow her inside the Sterling Room. Didn't need to. I'd seen enough. Back home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Used to be filled with laughter, with the hum of a life that meant something. Now it was just walls and furniture. I walked to the bar cart in the corner, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and sat at the kitchen table. Laid out everything I knew. Taylor's change in routine. The late nights. The shift in how she dressed, how she carried herself. The way she'd stopped looking at me like I was her husband and started looking past me like I was an obligation. And now I had a name. Nathaniel Larson. Wealthy, connected, and stupid enough to think I wouldn't notice. I pulled the manila folder from my bag, flipping through the reports. Financials, real estate holdings, a few whisperings of sketchy business deals. The kind of thing that, if pushed into the right hands, could make his life very complicated. I wasn't a man who flew off the handle. I'd seen men do that, let their anger take the wheel and steer them right off a cliff. I wasn't about to go kicking in doors or throwing punches like some bar brawler. No, men like Nathaniel didn't fear fists. They feared exposure. They feared losing control. I pulled out my laptop and got to work. First things first, my money. I'd built my security consulting business from the ground up and there wasn't a chance in hell I was letting Taylor walk away with half of it. I logged into my accounts, started the paperwork to shift my assets into a private trust. Quietly, without raising alarms. My phone buzzed. A text from Taylor. Running late. Don't wait up. I stared at the screen, then set the phone down without replying. I finished my drink, then poured another. A man has a right to be angry when his wife betrays him. But anger alone won't win the war. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, listening to the clock tick, listening for the sound of Taylor coming in. She was careful. Slipped through the door quietly, walked lightly across the floor. She thought I was asleep. I wasn't. The next morning, she was already dressed when I came downstairs. Hair done, makeup subtle but perfect. She turned when she heard me, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Morning," she said. "You're up early." I poured coffee, took my time stirring in a spoonful of sugar. "Didn't sleep much." She hesitated. "Just for a second. Everything okay?" I looked at her then. Really looked at her. The woman I married was still in there somewhere, but she was buried under something else now, secrets, lies, whatever version of herself she thought she needed to be. "Yeah," I said, taking a sip. "Everything's fine." She relaxed, shoulders dropping just a little. "Good. I've got a long day, so I might be late again tonight." I nodded, setting my mug down. "Figured." She picked up her purse, moving toward the door. "Love you." She always said it like a habit, like something expected. And for the first time, I didn't say it back. She hesitated again, just for a beat, then walked out. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, thinking about the pieces moving on the board. Taylor thought she had control of the game. She didn't know I'd already started playing. The morning stretched long after Taylor left. I sat with my coffee until it was cold, watching the light shift across the kitchen walls. My father always said a man should never make a move out of anger. "Patience wins wars," he told me once, standing in a field of dying crops, watching the sky like it owed him something. He didn't wait for miracles. He waited for moments. I learned the difference young. By noon I was downtown. My lawyer's office was on the 12th floor of a high-rise, a clean, glass-covered building that smelled like money and control. Matthew Keller had been handling my business contracts for years, sharp, ruthless when necessary, and a man who understood the value of quiet efficiency. He looked up when I walked in, checked his watch. "Didn't have you on the schedule, Jack." Something came up. I sat across from him, placed a folder on his desk. "Need to start making some moves." Quietly. Matthew opened it, flipping through the documents I'd gathered. Bank transfers, business holdings, property deeds. He read fast, tapping a pen against his desk. "Taylor know about any of this yet?" "Not yet." "You planning on telling her?" I met his eyes. "Not until it's too late for her to do a damn thing about it." Matthew nodded like he expected that. "Divorce?" "Not yet. Just getting my ducks in a row." He leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "I can move your business into a protected trust. Separate assets. She won't see a dime of it in the settlement." "Good." He pulled a legal pad closer, scribbling notes. "Anything else?" I thought about Nathaniel. About the way Taylor leaned into him, laughing at whatever bullshit he whispered in her ear. "You ever hear of a guy named Nathaniel Larson?" Matthew smirked. "Yeah. Investment guy. Plays dirty but keeps his hands clean." "Why?" "He's the reason I'm sitting here." Matthew nodded slowly, tapping the pen again. "That kind of problem, you looking for legal solutions or something off the books?" I didn't answer right away. Just let the weight of the question sit between us. Then I smiled. "Let's start legal. See where it gets us." By the time I left, the wheels were already turning. Money moving. Protections locking into place. Taylor wouldn't notice anything was different until she did. I stopped by McKenna's cafe on the way back, walked in just as Peter was wiping down the counter. He looked up, tossed a rag over his shoulder. "Twice in 1 week? Must be my lucky day. Or you make decent coffee." I took my usual stool, nodding toward the espresso machine. "That thing's still getting fancy customers?" Peter grinned. "If by fancy you mean slimy rich guys, then yeah. Your boy Larson was in again yesterday. Ordered some fancy nonsense. Brought the same blonde. That right?" He leaned in, voice dropping a little. "Something off about him. The way he talks. Like he's sizing people up every second. Got the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing he's got dirt on everybody else." I stirred my coffee, considering that. "Anybody got dirt on him?" Peter chuckled. "If they do, they're either paid off or buried." I sipped my coffee. "We'll see." That night, Taylor came home late again. I was in the garage, working on my truck, when I heard the car pull in. I didn't move, just kept working, waiting for the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. She hesitated before coming in, like she was steeling herself for something. She found me under the hood, hands covered in grease. "Hey," she said, like she wasn't sure what mood she was walking into. "Hey," I replied, keeping my focus on the engine. "Long day." Something like that. She stood there a second longer, like she wanted me to ask about her night, about why she smelled like expensive whiskey and someone else's cologne. When I didn't, she turned and went inside. I let her go. She thought she still had time. She didn't. The next morning, Taylor was already gone when I woke up. No note, no text, just the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the house. I made coffee, black and strong, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at a coming storm. Fitting. By the time I made it downtown, things were already in motion. Matthew had moved fast. My business assets were locked in the trust out of reach. The house, which I had bought before marrying Taylor, was legally untouchable. The only thing left was making sure Nathaniel felt the heat before he even saw the fire. I parked outside Larson Capital, a sleek, modern tower where money never slept. I wasn't going inside. Not yet. Instead, I walked down the block to Barclay and Finch, a high-end law firm where an old Marine buddy of mine worked as a private investigator. Tom Quinn, thick-built, salt and pepper hair, the kind of guy who still carried himself like he was in a war zone. He grinned when he saw me walk in. "Damn, Jack. Thought you were too busy making money to visit an old friend." I shook his hand. "Got a job for you." His grin faded. "This personal or business?" "Personal." I slid an envelope across the desk. "Nathaniel Larson. I want everything. The kind of things that don't show up in Forbes." Tom opened the folder, flipping through the few scraps I had. He whistled low. "Rich, connected, and dirty as hell, I'd bet. You sure you want to kick this particular hornet's nest?" I held his gaze. "I'm not just kicking it. I'm burning it down." Tom smirked. "Give me a week." I left knowing one thing: Nathaniel's time was running out. That night, Taylor came home late again. She walked into the kitchen, pausing when she saw me at the table, papers spread out in front of me. Divorce filings, bank transfers, business contracts. She didn't notice them at first, too busy pulling off her heels. "Long day?" I asked without looking up. "Yeah," she said, running a hand through her hair. "Meetings ran over." "That what they call it now?" She froze, just for a second, before turning to face me. "What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Means I know, Taylor." Silence stretched between us, thick as a Texas summer. She didn't deny it, didn't pretend she didn't understand. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, tried to recover. "Jack, save it." I cut in. "I don't need excuses, and I don't need apologies. You made your choice." Her eyes darted to the papers on the table. She stepped closer, saw my name, her name, the legalese of an inevitable ending. Her face paled. "You've already handled it," I finished for her. "You get what's fair, nothing more. No alimony, no claim to the business. House stays mine." She shook her head, stepping back like she needed space. "You can't just decide that without." "I can," I said flatly. "And I did." Her breath hitched, panic creeping in now. "You don't understand." "I understand just fine. I understand you weren't happy. I understand you thought he was a better option. I also understand he's not going to be able to help you much longer." Her lips parted, confusion flickering behind her eyes. "What does that mean?" I stood, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "You'll find out soon enough." She didn't speak after that, just stood there, staring as I walked past her, heading for the garage. I needed air, needed distance. But most of all, I needed to be ready for what came next. Nathaniel thought he could take something from me and walk away clean. He was about to learn otherwise. By the time the sun came up, the wheels were already turning. Tom had done his job well. The email landed in my inbox just past dawn. Attachments, notes, a few key details that made it clear Nathaniel Larson wasn't half as untouchable as he thought. Fraud. Off-the-books deals. A few investors who might be very interested to know where their money had really gone. Not enough to put him in a cell, not yet, but enough to make his life very, very difficult. I sat in my truck outside Larson Capital, watching the lobby doors cycle through the morning rush. It didn't take long. Nathaniel stepped out just after 8, dressed sharp, moving slow, exuding the kind of arrogance that came with old money and long habits of getting away with things. He adjusted his cufflinks, pulled out his phone, tapped a message. I stepped out of my truck and crossed the street. He didn't notice me until I was right next to him. "Mr. Larson," I said, my voice even. He glanced up, surprised, then adjusted fast, slipping into that easy, practiced smile. "Can I help you?" I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of me standing there. He was taller than me, but size didn't mean a damn thing if you weren't ready to use it. "You already have," I said finally, pulling an envelope from my jacket. I held it out. He hesitated before taking it, flipping it open. His expression barely changed, but I saw the tick in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened just a fraction. "This is quite the collection of paperwork," he said, voice calm. "Where'd you get it?" "Doesn't matter." He folded the papers neatly, tucking them under his arm. "And what do you plan to do with this information?" I smiled, just enough to let him know I wasn't bluffing. "That depends on you." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Chandler?" I held his gaze. "And no, I'm not threatening you, Nathaniel. I'm just letting you know how things are gonna go from here." He exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath. "And how is that?" "You're going to walk away from my wife," I said simply. "Completely. No calls, no messages, no whispered promises. You're also going to have a very bad week, professionally speaking. Investors are going to start asking questions. Auditors might get interested. Hell, the press might sniff around. But you're going to take it on the chin. Because if you so much as blink in my direction, I'll make sure this is just the beginning of your problems." His lips pressed together, a flicker of something behind his eyes. I could see the gears turning. He was calculating, weighing risk, deciding whether I was worth the trouble. After a moment, he sighed and shook his head. "Taylor's not worth this kind of war, you know? Then it should be real easy for you to walk away," I said. He chuckled, low and tired, like a man who had played this game too long. "You're a real piece of work, Chandler." I didn't say anything, just held his stare until he looked away first. He adjusted his jacket, gave me one last look, then turned and walked back inside. I stood there a moment longer, watching the doors close behind him, then pulled out my phone and sent a single text. "It's done." Tom replied almost instantly. "Good. Now sit back and enjoy the fireworks." I slid the phone back into my pocket and walked back to my truck. There was still work to do. Taylor had a reckoning coming, too. The fallout started faster than I expected. By the next morning, Nathaniel Larson's name was all over the business pages. Investigations, investor panic, whispers of fraud. The kind of trouble that sticks. The kind that doesn't go away with a well-placed check. I read the headlines over a cup of coffee, let it settle in. One problem handled. Now for the other. Taylor came home earlier than usual that night. The front door creaked open, and I heard the click of her heels across the hardwood. She stopped when she saw me in the living room, the divorce papers sitting on the table between us. For the first time in weeks, she didn't put on an act. Didn't try to pretend nothing was wrong. "You went after him," she said quietly, setting her purse down. I took a slow sip of coffee. "I handled what needed handling." She swallowed, arms folding tight across her chest. "What did you do?" I leaned back, stretched my legs out. "Just even the playing field." "You were betting on the wrong horse, Taylor. Larson's finished. His money won't save him this time." She sucked in a breath, shaking her head. "You don't get to do this, Jack." I raised a brow. "Do what?" "Control everything." I laughed, a low, dry sound. "That's rich, coming from you." Her face flushed, but she didn't deny it. "I made a mistake," she said finally. I nodded. "You did." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "So what now? You destroy me, too." I studied her, the woman I'd built a life with, the woman I thought I knew. There was a time I might have felt something seeing her like this, cornered, unraveling. Not anymore. "You destroy yourself," I said evenly. This is just me making sure you don't take me down with you." She pressed her lips together, eyes flashing with something between anger and regret. So that's it? Just done. I looked at the papers on the table. It was done the second you made your choice. She didn't say anything after that. Just stood there for a long moment, like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. Then she reached for her purse, turned toward the stairs. "Don't bother packing much," I said as she walked away. "You'll be out by the end of the week." She paused just for a second but didn't turn around. A moment later, I heard her footsteps heading up to the bedroom. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all settle in my chest. It was over. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I picked up the papers, flipped to the last page where she just had to sign. The last nail in the coffin. Then I poured myself a drink, sat back, and enjoyed the silence. 2 weeks later, she was gone. No dramatic goodbye, no last-ditch plea. Just a set of keys left on the kitchen counter and a text that I didn't bother reading. The house was mine again. Quiet. Orderly. The way it should be. I stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, the closet half empty, her scent fading from the air. I expected to feel something. Anger. Relief. Maybe even regret. Instead, I felt nothing at all. Just another chapter closed. The divorce finalized fast. Matthew handled it clean, just as promised. No alimony, no payout. She walked away with whatever she had in her personal accounts and nothing more. Fair, considering what she'd tried to pull. The last I heard, she was staying with a friend in Austin, looking for a job. I didn't ask for details. Didn't care. Larson went under in record time. Investors pulled out, lawsuits started piling up, and the media chewed him apart. The last article I read said he was facing federal charges. Securities fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion. A trifecta of rich man stupidity. He'd be lucky if he saw daylight again. Poetic, really? I went back to work. The security firm kept me busy, and I hired 2 younger guys, ex-military men who needed a place to land. Good workers. Reminded me of myself when I first got out. We landed a new contract in Dallas, high profile. More money than I needed, but that wasn't the point. I built this company from nothing. I wasn't about to let a woman who stopped being my wife long before I knew it take a damn thing from me. One afternoon, I found myself back at McKenna's, same seat at the counter, same coffee in front of me. Peter leaned against the counter, watching me the way men do when they know you've been through the fire and come out harder. "Haven't seen her around," he said finally. "Won't," I replied, taking a sip. He nodded, thoughtful. "Some men wouldn't have handled it like you did." I smirked. "Some men get stupid. Some men get smart." He chuckled, wiping down the counter. "Guess we know which one you are." I didn't reply. Just finished my coffee, paid my tab, and walked out. The truck felt familiar, solid beneath my hands as I drove out past the city limits. The old road leading out to my father's ranch was still the same, dusty, winding, lined with barbed wire fences that stretched into the hills. I hadn't been out there in years, but I still had the keys. Still had a claim to the land. When I pulled up, I stepped out and stood by the fence, staring out over the fields, the house in the distance, the old barn leaning with age but still standing. Some things break. Some things hold. I wasn't broken. Never had been. Never would be. I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and turned onto the open road. The past was behind me, the future ahead. And for the first time in a long damn time, I knew exactly where I was going.